because this might be the inner chronicle of what we are, and we have to articulate ourselves, otherwise we would be cows in a field.
Welcome to Cows in the Field. This is a show in which we discuss philosophical themes in popular films. My name is Justin.
I'm Laura.
And today we're joined by Dan Wack, professor of philosophy at Knox College, to discuss Elaine May's Mikey and Nicky.
Peter Falk is Mikey.
I got a terrific suggestion for you, Nick. I suggest you find somebody you can trust.
John Cassavetes is Nicky.
They're gonna kill me, Nick. They're gonna kill me.
Mikey and Nicky. On a night like this, there are no rules.
You give me that in 30 seconds, you hear me, or I'll kill you. I'm gonna die. You're not gonna die.
What do you think they're planning? To shoot you in a movie house?
Mikey and Nicky.
Hey, Dan, welcome to Cows in the Field.
Hi, guys. Thanks for having me.
Well, so when we talked about having you on, and you mentioned that you're writing a book about Hollywood gangster films, and you gave us a list of films, and we ended up settling on Mikey and Nicky, which is a slightly unusual Hollywood gangster film. But before we get to Mikey and Nicky, I wanted to just ask about the book, like what drew you to the topic, and how you see sort of philosophy integrating with gangster films.
Yeah, great. I wrote a dissertation on The Sopranos, which is the short answer to this question.
Wait, for real? Your whole dissertation?
My dissertation was on Lessing, Elizabeth Anscombe and Theory of Descriptions, and The Sopranos, and then the way in which. So,
that's awesome.
In the dissertation, I was very interested in using The Sopranos as an example to try to think more clearly about how genre as an art critical category works and how medium also works, and to bring them together. And so the original idea was I wanted to write about art on television. That was the original idea. And then once I settled on The Sopranos as the example, I became very interested in the way in which it was inheriting the history of gangster movies and doing it in a new medium. You know, I think The Sopranos essentially invented a new way of doing American television, organized around the season. And, you know, there were precursors to that, but The Sopranos, I think, is a very important TV show in that. I mean, that's not a controversial thing to say, I don't think. But,
sure, yeah.
In the process of thinking through what I wanted to say about The Sopranos, I kind of very early on in the project came to think about the history of gangster movies as really having like four basic phases.
Okay. So
one is the birth of the gangster movie around 1928, 1930, essentially with the invention of sound in movies. There's 1928, which has Underworld, which was a silent movie that was a version of the Al Capone story, basically. And then with the invention of sound, essentially 1930, 31, 32, you have Little Caesar, The Public Enemy, and the original Scarface.
Right.
And then in the wake of, among other things, Scarface and the controversies presented by Scarface, they implemented the code, the Hollywood kind of movie code that kind of morphed the way in which gangster movies worked. Anyway, there's a story to tell about those initial movies in which the gangster is a figure of action. He's a figure of violent aggression. He takes what he wants because he wants it. Um, and I was really struck by an essay by Robert Warshaw called The Gangster's Tragic Hero, which Warshaw wrote in about 1948, 49, something like that. And it's a retrospect, it's a look, it's an incredible essay, just absolutely amazing. I can't recommend it highly enough. It's only like maybe 6 pages or something. It was quite dense but brief, and he's a great writer and a great critic. And so I kind of fell in love with that essay and was thinking about all of the ways in which The Soprano wasn't doing what those early movies were doing. Because if you read the Warshaw essay and you watch those movies, it's like really interesting that The Sopranos is like the first piece of popular culture to do a sustained look at therapy. And that the gangster is the one who's on the couch and talking through his problems. It seems like the least likely figure from the history of early Hollywood. If you were to look at like, oh, who's going to end up in therapy on the couch to pick out Scarface or The Public Enemy or any of these guys.
Yeah. Although, and just to bring in Mikey and Nicky here briefly, I mean, like these two guys could stand to be on the couch.
Yes. They are people who, I mean, I think of them as paradigmatic of really the third phase.
Okay. So what's the second phase then?
So the second phase is film noir.
Right.
In which film noir, you have the gangster becoming a kind of liminal figure for the world. He's often a presence in the movie. So like in Out of the Past, there's a gangster. The protagonist is not really a gangster, or not quite. Anyway, he's trying to resist living like a gangster. And so I mean, film noir, obviously, those are some of the most interesting movies Hollywood ever made. And I think they get more interesting when you start to think about them as movies about what it is to live in a world that's governed by the rules that the gangster sets for us, where you have people who are trying in various ways to resist being gangsters themselves. So that's the second phase. And then the third phase, I think, really starts with The Godfather in 1972. And generally focuses on a figure I call the rationalizing gangster. So this is a gangster who's not the one who's carrying out the violence often. He's rationalizing it and allowing it to happen by distancing himself from it in particular ways. And that's obviously the precursor to the Sopranos. Tony Soprano is the kind of like really most elaborate version of this rationalizing gangster, in which and going to therapy and putting himself on the couch. Over the course of that series, he basically reveals himself to be a psychotic pretending to be a neurotic. He's pretending, and it's enabling, the therapy is enabling him to continue to be a gangster. So I became, in the process of writing that dissertation, very kind of obsessed with the history of gangster movies, and especially this third phase. These are all movies that I discovered becoming a movie fan growing up in the 80s and 90s. And so they're all movies that I like had other kinds of attachments to. Before I started writing about gangsters, I was a fan of these movies, basically. And there's obviously a lot of great gangster movies from 1972 to 1999 when The Sopranos started. And I decided that I would kind of focus on 9 movies that really bring out the things I think are most interesting about this rationalizing gangster figure.
And that's in the third phase in the 70s. Right. So the book was going to be about 70s, 80s gangster films. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So it's the first movie in terms of chronology is The Godfather, which was a huge hit and set a new paradigm for what the Hollywood gangster could be. In the book, the first essay is Mean Streets, Martin Scorsese's so-called debut film, even though he'd already made like 4 or 5 movies before that. But there's a lot from those early movies, those early post-Godfather years. So Mean Streets, The Godfather, Across 110th Street, The Godfather Part 2, Mikey and Nicky. Those are all early. Those all went into production in the early 70s.
Yeah.
For various reasons, it took Mikey and Nicky a long time to actually come out. So it went into production in 1973, but didn't actually get released until 1976. But they're all basically from like the same 3-year span.
Mm-hmm.
And then I have 4 movies from the 80s, Once Upon a Time in America, which is from 1984, and then Married to the Mob, 1988, and Goodfellas and Miller's Crossing, which are both 1990. And then I do kind of feel like I could just keep going on because there's lots of great 90s gangster movies too, but it seemed like more than enough. So and for various reasons, I like the idea of giving the kind of final word to Goodfellas and Miller's Crossing together. So
cool.
That's why I'm in there.
Well, it's a fascinating project. And I mean, one of the things that I think is so interesting about where Mikey and Nicky sits in this space is that it is, I mean, if you put it next to The Godfather, it's just so different. I mean, stylistically, maybe there are going to be similarities that as we talk, will kind of come out, but stylistically, it's very different. What it focuses on is very different. It focuses on the low level guys, not the high level guys in the sort of community. And for the most part, it backgrounds all of the crime. So, it's all off screen what kind of crimes these guys have been committed. In a way, the film could just be 2 dudes, friendship between these 2 guys like crumbling slowly over the course of one night. And that kind of made me think of it like in the spirit of those kind of one night hangout movies. Like the whole time, this was our first time watching it, and the whole time I was thinking about a movie like After Hours or even, kind of like Repo Man, just kind of these hangout movies, or even weirdly Breakfast Club. A movie where, sort of 4 people are kind of connected, but then, are just forced together and they the journey that the relationship takes as they go on. And so let's just talk about this as a gangster film. So how do you see Mikey and Nicky fitting into that third wave of Hollywood gangster films?
Well, we can just start with the contrast with The Godfather, because I think that's very helpful. I think in the list of the 9 movies I'm bringing together in this genre conversation, there's kind of multiple fault lines, but they kind of they cut in 2 different ways. So one is the rationalizing gangster who's a historical figure, is a figure from our past, either historical past or mythic past, who's very powerful. Both the Godfather movies fit this pattern. Once Upon a Time in America fits this pattern, and Miller's Crossing is the 4th one out of the 9 that I've kind of laid out that are about, among other things, why today is like today, but in a mythic way, right? So, and then you have the contemporary rationalizing gangster, which for me, Mikey and Nicky is a part of, with Mean Streets and Goodfellas and Across 110th Street, and then Married to the Mob, which is a more complicated case that Married to the Mob has very interesting kind of genre connections because it's structured as a comedy in ways that the other gangster movies aren't. But those are all movies about contemporary life. They're all about low-level gangsters. they often don't feel like gangster movies. Your reaction to Mikey and Nicky, I've had people had that reaction to Mean Streets too. Just shock or surprise. They've never thought of Mean Streets, a movie they love and have seen a lot, as a gangster movie. They think of it as a movie about friendship and friendship, a kind of hangout movie. I think that's important. So, I do think, obviously, Mikey and Nicky is the movie about two friends hanging out together over the course of one night. But the one guy's trying to kill the other. And and part of the way in which the movie works is that sometimes you forget that, and sometimes they almost forget it. And it's part of what gives the movie the kind of wild charge and sense of life it has. I think that it is a hangout movie. It is part of the thrill is just watching Cassavetes and Falk bounce off of each other in the way in which they can. And, I love both of them. I think both of them are incredible in this movie. But it is also the case that it's a very particular kind of gangster movie. It's about the aftermath of a heist gone wrong. We never see the heist. We know no details about it. We know that Nicky and a guy named Ed Lipsky ripped off Dave Resnick. We don't really know what the ripoff was about, but Lipsky's already dead when the movie starts, and Nicky's hanging out, hiding out, isolating himself, kind of terrified to make any move at all. Yeah. And then the movie starts with him calling Mikey. Yeah. And so, I think it is, to me, it takes for granted the gangster as a kind of background. Yes. In a way in which you don't have, they're not really concerned about the money. It's very like, Resnick wants to kill Nicky like he killed Lipsky, but not because he wants the money back, but because he wants to make it clear you can't rip off Dave Resnick. Yeah. And so a lot of the things that you find in a lot of gangster movies about Mean Streets, especially, Mean Streets is like really obsessed with money and tracking who owes who what and who's going to buy drinks with what $10. And you're like really kind of obsessively tracking the circulation of money and how it's relating to these characters. Mikey and Nicky just undercuts the whole issue. The only way in which the money matters is that Mikey owes Nicky $200.
Yeah. Right. But that money keeps trying to go back and forth a couple times. Yeah. Like on the bus, Mikey tries to give it to Nicky, and Nicky's like, I don't need it right now. I'll let you know if I need it, but like, I'm good. So it stays with Mikey. And then Mikey gives it to him again after they've had their big fight. And I think he throws it on the ground. I don't think Nicky picks it up.
No, he does. He goes back to pick it up. He does. Okay. He goes back after.
I think one of the funniest, I think there's a lot of really funny things in the movie, but Mikey's in the car with Warren Kinney, the Ned Beatty character, who's the hitman who Resnick has hired to kill Nicky. And Mikey is having him like drive around the streets, and he says, well, we don't want to go back to the spot where we had our fight because he's not going to be just standing there in the middle of the street. And then there's a hard cut right back to Nicky standing in the middle of the street where they had the fight, picking up the $200.
Oh, okay. I missed that.
So he does actually, I think part of the joke is he doesn't want to accept it from Mikey. That's crucial to him. Yeah. But then once he's on his own and doesn't know what to do, he kind of compulsively goes back and picks it up.
It's $200 in 1973 is that's a good amount of money. I would get that off the street too.
So Dan, one of the things you said that I think is really important about this film is that he doesn't want Mikey to know, or he doesn't want to accept it. He doesn't want to, he doesn't want to visibly be taking the money from Mikey. And I think this to me was this idea of like you're trying to hide who you really are from the person that you're sort of standing across from in order to, for what reason? I mean, again, it's for different reasons, but like similarly with Resnick, like he doesn't need the money. He just wants to show everyone. He wants to make a statement that he's the kind of guy that if you rip off, he'll kill you. And I think Mikey is Nicky doesn't want to seem to be the kind of guy who needs money. Mikey doesn't want to seem to be the kind of guy who would betray his friend. He wants to come across and seem as a really good guy. And like his central conflict in this movie, I think, is my read on it, having seen it once, is that it's like he wants Nicky to die because that's what he's decided, but he doesn't want Nicky to know that he wants Nicky to die. So he wants to be perceived by Nicky and maybe the rest of the universe in some sense.
He wants to be the hero until the very end.
Exactly. And I mean, one thing about this that I think is, a very interesting little detail that, I mean, so much of this movie May is just dropping in tiny little offhand remarks is in that first conversation that Kinney has with Mikey, which we don't know Mikey's on the other end of the phone in that.
Right, until
Kinney
the very end, it cuts back.
Until Kinney says, I'm going to call the restaurant, and that when I do, you get up and leave. You can get up and leave. Like he does not want to be there when the act happens.
Yeah.
He can't sort of, my read is he can't sort of deal with being seen by Nicky as his assassin in a way. But anyway, that was just to say, I think a lot of this, a lot of the movie seems to be that these guys obsessing about how they are perceived by the other.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think it's a little different with Nicky, I think, than Mikey because, Mikey and Nicky share this kind of strong sense that they want the other one to think of them as their friend. They both have that in common.
Yeah.
And it's cutting in different ways for Mikey, who's actively participating in a murder plot against Nicky as everything is unfolding. But Nicky has also treated Mikey very badly, it seems like. And I don't think it's at all clear, certainly that I would want to say that they are friends and the rich sense of wanting the other's good, So, but they are very, very concerned that the other one thinks of them as the friend.
Right.
And, I mean, part of what's interesting about the movie is everyone's incredibly paranoid. Everyone thinks that they're that everyone's out to get them.
Yeah.
And part of the way it plays out is they're all paranoid and they're all right.
Right. Yeah.
That Nicky is right, that Mikey is working with Resnick to try to kill him. And, Mikey is right that he should blame Kinney for messing up rather than trying to take the fall himself. And, just all of everyone's kind of paranoia with respect to the other, I think, May's very careful about the way in which they're not wrong.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, another example of this is Nicky tells, so there's this pivotal scene, which we should talk about in more detail, but at some point, but Nicky tells Mikey when they're having it out in the middle of the street, he says Resnick doesn't like you. Like I stood up for him. You make him nervous or something. I can't remember how he said it.
You put him on edge.
You put him on edge. And then you see later, Mikey hanging out with Resnick and Kinney and Resnick is clearly on edge. He doesn't like being around him. So they're all, and that's the thing that irritates Mikey so much is he doesn't want to be perceived as anything other than basically a loyal person. And they just, the guy doesn't like him. It's just sad that, it's he likes Nicky, weirdly enough. People seem to like Nicky.
Nicky's charismatic.
He's funny.
He's
chaotic.
He's fun, yeah. Mikey's a bit of a stick in the mud.
Yeah.
By the 10th time, he's like, there isn't any parking at my house. Resnick is like, oh, for the love of God.
Well, I mean, I do think it is, first of all, that whole scene, I think, does get very funny. I mean, Peter Falk has just got incredible timing. But
totally
the way in which that scene builds, where the thing has gone badly, and he doesn't want Resnick to blame him. He also realizes about a second and a half after Resnick realizes that the best place to kill Nicky is at his doorstep.
Yeah.
Right. And then the whole scene is him trying to get Resnick to have Kenny kill him literally any place except the front door of his house. And he fails. And so he keeps going on about like, well, don't do it in front of my house. I live in an exclusive neighborhood. We've got this like homeowners pact. They've got private. I mean, he starts going on about essentially HOA rules. Yeah. And we've got these private security forces and they're not going to like it if you're just parked on the street, and Kenny's like, oh, I can circle the block. That's fine. But as it's going on, the thing that Mikey doesn't want to have, it's not just that he doesn't want Nicky to have to recognize that he's sold him out, that Mikey is not a good friend to him, that Mikey has chosen Resnick over him in the initial. I mean, it gets more complicated because the way in which the night goes on, the way I read the movie, I do think Mikey changes his mind and then changes it back.
Interesting.
Over the course of the movie. So, and we can talk about that in a second, but by the time he's in Kenny's office, he's changed it back. I mean, he is committed to it, but he doesn't want to have to think of himself as the one responsible for the violence.
He
wants it to be somebody else who's
that's right. I mean, another example of this is in the cemetery when they've had this conversation about whether there's an afterlife. And Mikey says, I don't believe in that. I don't believe in anything. I just, when you're dead, you're dead. And Nicky's like, well, when you're facing death, you think about this kind of stuff. And, and then they go and they're stepping over graves and Mikey's apologizing. And Nicky's like, why are you apologizing? You don't believe in this stuff. And then I think it's just funny. It's this offhand remark that Nicky makes where he says, hey, Ma, if anything happens to me, Mikey did it. And this like puts Peter Falk totally on edge. He's like, you take that back. Like it's like the first time he's like really angry at Nicky and this whole movie.
The only time all night that they've said to each other what's going on.
Yeah.
That line in particular. And it is... That line totally changes the dynamic.
Yeah.
Mikey is walking away. He's like, right. And Nicky uses it to turn him back around.
Yeah.
And they do then come to a new understanding of their friendship and the way in which their childhood together is significant for both of them.
Yeah.
In ways that are, I take at least to be a kind of a genuine insight.
Yeah.
For Mickey especially, that Mickey forgot or doesn't like to remember that Nicky knew his brother Izzy, who died when they were very young, and that they have this history together in which Nicky knew his family, he knew his father, he knew his brother who died, and the moment that you pick out, Justin, where he says, hey, Ma, if anything happens to me, Mikey did it. That is the moment, I think, at which Mikey does change his mind.
Yeah.
Or start to.
Yeah.
And then, he changes it back after what happens at Nell's apartment and then the fight in the street. But I do think it is important that is the moment where he starts to change his mind. It is also the most honest moment until maybe the fight in the street where they really split. And it's it's Nicky pretending to talk to somebody else.
Pretending
to talk to his mom. He's not actually addressing Mikey directly.
Yeah.
Hey, Ma, where are you?
All right, I'm going.
Ma?
I'm going, Nick.
I'm here.
I'm going.
Hey, Ma. Ma? If anything happens to me, Mikey did it.
Hey, take that back!
Oh, you still here? I thought you left.
You son of a bitch, take it back!
Okay, Ma, I take it back. You'll find out for yourself anyway.
I think it is interesting, though, that I totally see this read of the film. I mean, I think part of what's magical about the film is that we were watching it for the first time and not knowing where this is going, how these guys are related to one another. So it's hard to catch that they might be changing their tune, because you're just trying to get your bearings on where they are related to one another. But I think the magic is that you're right. Now that I think about it again, I'm thinking, so part of what makes him change his mind is the realization of their shared history, that how far back they go, how that he really is Mikey, that is the older brother to Nicky that he lost in terms of Izzy. And then you see it as further evidence, and I imagine this is where you're going, so feel free to speak more on this if you want. But then they're on the bus after heading to Nell's apartment, and that's when Mikey says, "You know what? I'm going with you.
I'm coming with you." Yeah. I really felt like he believed that in that moment.
Yeah.
So I think having only watched the movie the first time, I wasn't totally he's changed his mind, but I felt like whether or not he's totally changed his mind, he believes himself in that moment when he says it to
I mean,
Nicky.
I think it's an incredible. I mean, I'm such a huge Falk fan, especially in this movie. But the moment you're talking about on the bus, where he gives a genuine smile, and it really is. I mean, that's part of why I do think he does commit, for whatever that means, for an hour or so, that he is going to help Nicky escape. That's what they're doing now. And then as soon as Nicky realizes that's what happened, he completely sabotages it and blows it up, I think.
Oh, so you're thinking that Nicky realizes. So you're thinking, okay, this is really interesting. Let me just try to spell this out. So you're thinking maybe in some sense Nicky knows that Mikey is turned on him. Then Mickey realizes that Mikey has come back, and then Nicky, as a result of that, has to sabatage it. Is that the thought? Oh,
basically. I mean, I think that's the basic dynamic. I mean, I think Nicky he's paranoid the whole time, but he's growing kind of increasingly suspicious through the first half of the movie.
Yes,
for sure.
And, he knows they're waiting super long in the bar, and then it's weird that they've immediately left the bar and Mikey needs to make another phone call, and then so they're he gives them the destination for the movie theater, and then gets off the bus and refuses to go to the movie theater. So and culminating in the line, Justin, that you mentioned, "Hey, Ma, if anything happens to me, it's Mikey who did it." Right. So I think Nicky is fairly clearly on to the general dynamic, or at least highly suspicious, and right to be so.
Totally.
Mikey is selling him out in exactly this way. And so, but then and this is, I think, related to the question of the $200, which we were talking about earlier. I don't think he can stand to be indebted to Mikey. I don't think he can stand to feel like Mikey is his equal. I think that's part of why he just blows it up. That it's really important to him that he's better than Mikey. And he's better than Mikey in a lot of ways. Yeah. And I also think, a lot of these rationalizing gangster movies have this kind of, in contrast with the very first 30s gangster movies, those are all structured like tragedies in the sense that you could name the movie after the guy because it's one figure and you're tracking, right? So it's Scarface and The Public Enemy and Little Caesar, and you are tracking one person's rise and fall. in these later 1970s movies, it's always a double figure or more than one figure, in which there's a gangster who's like connected with action and violence and unpredictability, but seems more unhinged or like less kind of grounded in society. And then there's his friend who's like nominally the kind of saner one, or the one who's plays by the rules. You get this kind of like dynamic, Sonny and Michael in The Godfather, for example, Charlie and Johnny Boy in Mean Streets. In Goodfellas, you get a kind of complicated version of it where there's three gangsters, the Henry Hill and Jimmy Conway, the Robert De Niro character, and then the Joe Pesci character who's like completely out of control. But those movies they're all about, in the way that Mikey and Nicky is too, I think, about the way in which everybody's kind of like pushing around responsibility for what's happening in a way that I think in Mikey and Nicky especially, Nicky knows what's happening. He also, I think, like a lot of these more out of control gangsters from the 70s, it's like semi-suicidal, basically. Like, it's not at all clear that he's watching him, you would say, oh, this is a guy who's trying to live, or like trying to like, I do think there is kind of this sense in which it's not that he wants to live, it's that he wants Mikey to want him to live. That's the thing that he wants. Yeah. And he's really, as soon as he gets it, he can't stand it and he blows it up.
That's so interesting.
Wow.
Yeah. And I think too, I mean, it's like the two of them, their relationship dynamic is so convoluted in this sense, in that neither can admit this to the other. Neither can admit that this sort of the contradiction at the core of them. And yet the other one knows it. Because I think Mikey also knows that Nicky wants to feel better than him. And he calls him out on it after the scene at Nellie's, where he says, you wanted me to try to hook up with her and fail. And you
made me out a joke.
Yeah,
what he keeps calling you to resonate again to Nell. Yeah,
and then of course Nicky denies it again and again, which to the viewer then for the first time you're thinking, what am I supposed to make of any of this? This is complicated. But you're right that if you put it in that context of like these two guys who, like, part of the complexity of their dynamic is that they know what's going on with the other one, but neither can admit to the other one what's going on, or that they know what's going on in some sense. It's like, it is, I mean, it's like a really interesting kind of comedy of manners in a way.
You call me the Echo. And you tell everybody that I have to say everything twice because I got a tunnel in my head. The second time is the Echo.
Listen, Mikey, everybody says everything. I mean, what's the difference? I was kidding. Don't you ever kid?
You make me out a joke to Resnick. Just like you made me out a joke to that girl.
Mikey, you're wrong.
And I'd do anything for you. Anything. And unless you're sick or in trouble, you don't even know I'm alive. And now look what you did. Now you called me. Now I came and look what you did. And for no reason. No fucking reason. Bullshit. Go find yourself another friend.
You're wrong. Really, Mike?
Well, and it's a way, I think that's a real theme in all of these rationalizing gangster movies, all these post-Godfather movies. I think they all hinge on this basic dynamic in which we're watching things happen. And for us as audience, there's ways that we want to describe what we're seeing that stands in very stark contrast to the way in which the gangsters themselves are describing what's happening. So that you get this kind of like ongoing contrast between what they're saying is happening and what we're watching happen. And I think all of these post-Godfather movies are kind of obsessed with this issue. The way in which rationalization takes the form of self-deception, the way in which the rationalization is caught up with a certain kind of relation to violence that allows the violence to happen. It organizes it and distances the person who's doing the organizing from it at the same time. So, you know, I think Mikey and Nicky give a really interesting version of that dynamic. Once you're thinking in those terms, you know, it is, you know, that fight on the street after, you know, they have that scene where they assault Nell, and Mikey's basic resentment is he knew Resnick first. He introduced Nicky to Resnick, and then Nicky has done nothing but make him out a joke to Resnick ever since, and and continually construct and reinforce this sense of difference between them, of hierarchy between them, that Nicky is winning at life in a way that Mikey's not. You know, which I think from our point of view seems totally crazy in all kinds of ways. I mean, Nicky seems very charismatic, but also like not a guy that you would admire. And he's like, it's not at all clear, for example, that he has a kid who's a couple months old. It's not at all clear watching the movie that he knows his daughter's name. He never uses his daughter's name the whole movie.
Wow.
And so, you know, he's constantly, oh, she's a great kid. Holds my thumb. Great kid.
Holds
you
my
know,
thumb.
Yeah, that's all he's got.
And so I do think that there is, certainly from my point of view, if it's like, well, who's winning between Mikey and Nicky? It's like, I guess Mikey, you know, he's in an HOA and like he's got like
he's got a nice house.
Yeah, exactly.
Cute matching
Got
furniture that is now filled with bullet holes.
Exactly. He's gonna need
the
a new
floral
door.
chairs. Yeah.
But then at the same time, Mikey, of course, doesn't perceive himself that way. And this is something that I hadn't clocked. And then you were telling me that because you had thought a little bit more about this, Laura, but about his relationship to his brother Izzy and what he says in describing the watch situation, right? And that he feels inferior, or he feels a kind of resentment in a way towards his brother, that his brother got the affection of his father, and he's unwilling to sort of recognize and deal with that, and the way he sort of describes that. And then of course Nicky is taking the place of Izzy. So of course all this gets like shunted from Izzy, who died when they were 10, to Nicky. But do you want to say more on that, Laura? Because
he's so insistent. First of all, it's interesting that Annie didn't know Izzy existed.
Right. Yeah.
But also when he's telling her this story, he's like, let me be clear that the watch was always intended for me. Right. I'm the oldest. He only gave it to him because he's dying. And then he knew he was just going to take him right off his dead hand and give it to me, the rightful owner. You know, like the way in which he said at pains to let his wife know that he was loved by his father, respected by his father, maybe the most loved by his father. He just wants to be the best loved, and he's just not the best loved, anywhere. But maybe in his own house, which he doesn't totally appreciate. Maybe.
Yeah. I was the favorite.
Oh, I see.
My father cried like a baby. And when Izzy got sick, he gave him his watch. The one I have.
Oh, the one you broke.
Yeah. But that was just because he was sick that he gave it to him. He meant it for me. I was the oldest. And when Izzy died, he took it back. He gave it to me. He only gave it to Izzy because Izzy was always asking to wear it. So I guess that, when he knew that Izzy was going to die, he felt that it was all right, safe to give it to him.
That's sad.
He claims all night to have like this great relationship with her, and he's constantly like lecturing Nicky about, I call my wife when I know that I'm going to be out.
I don't treat
giving
women the way
excuses
you
for
do.
why he's like, he's calling her so much because she's the contact person between him and Warren Kinney, the hitman. So, there's
to keep changing locations.
Yes.
On the Woody Woodpecker comic.
But no, Laura, I completely agree with you that he can only conceive of his relationship with his father and with Izzy and with Nicky in terms of competition for the father's love. And it's the exact same dynamic with Resnick, that it's just like straightforwardly. And I think part of what's so, he says to Resnick, last thing before he leaves, he says, "I'm sorry you don't like me, Dave." And Resnick says, "It doesn't matter." And it doesn't matter, because Mikey, the thing that Resnick cares about is that Mikey's giving up Nicky. That's it. He doesn't. Resnick doesn't like any of these guys. Like, but Mikey can't get out of that sense that everything he's doing is a kind of competition, and that it's a competition that he's been losing his entire life, and that he can't say out loud. It's incredibly, I just find it so upsetting. It's a very upsetting movie, but the moment at which Annie says, "I didn't know you had a brother," after he's spent all night talking about, "Oh, I don't need you, Nicky. I don't need you to help remember things. I can tell stories about my childhood to my wife. She loves hearing stories about my childhood." And then you realize, as soon as he says, "You like hearing stories about my childhood, don't you, Annie?" And she says, "Sure, of course I do." And then he starts to talk about the watch and about Izzy, and it becomes incredibly like painfully clear that she's never heard of Izzy. Anyway, it's a super upsetting end to the movie, especially.
Absolutely. Well, I wanted to ask you what you thought about how the ending parallels the beginning, in that in the beginning we have Mikey banging down Nicky's door, and then we have Nicky banging down Mikey's door. And I didn't really know what to think of that, but it's very deliberate. May sets up that these two things, neither wants to let the other in. I mean, maybe that's just it, but I don't know. But like what, but it is very explicit in the film. So, I mean, what should we make of that parallelism?
Well, I think the first thing to say here is it is a huge motif in the movie. It's not just that it opens and closes the movie with it, but there are lots of scenes in which there are two sides of a locked door, and there's a question about getting through that door. So they beat up the bus driver on the bus because he won't open the door. And it turns into this like insane scene in which the bus driver has parked the bus, refuses to open it, is going on and on about the regulations and how they have to go out the back door. And at a certain point, Nicky starts beating him up and Mikey starts helping. And then finally the guy opens the door. But, Nicky goes back to Nell's after he's had this fight with Mikey.
He bangs that door down.
He kicks the door down. Before that, he goes to his wife and mother-in-law's apartment, where his wife, he's separated from his wife, his daughter, she's taken the daughter and gone to her mother's. He goes to their apartment, and there's a whole scene where they're at the door and she won't let him in, and he has to talk his way in. He threatens violence at a certain point, but doesn't actually knock it down. So there's all of these scenes where they're on two sides of the door. It's often, really, other than the first scene, it's almost always Nicky who's being locked out,
trying to get in,
is trying to to force his way in, essentially, except on the bus where he's trying to force his way out. But anyway, yeah, no, I do think I think there's a lot of hate to make, and it is a way in which, Elaine May is just a brilliant, brilliant writer, and the movie seems, a lot of people, when they talk about it, act as if like the whole thing is improvised, or that like it's Cassavetes and Falk just kind of like riffing together. And I think the more you think about it, the more clear it is that, it's just like a piece of clockwork in a sense. She really has it honed in all of these kind of thematic ways in which you realize over time that you're seeing variations on the same scene.
Yeah.
Kind of repeatedly.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I had completely forgot that you're totally right about the bus scene, and then the two scenes with Nicky and the either the girlfriend or his ex-wife, and yeah, I do think it is a really interesting visual motif that a lot of the conversations in this film end up happening through a closed door, and one just immediate kind of knee-jerk reaction to that is that the door is a kind of representation of the walls these people are putting up between one another that prevent them from seeing one another for who they truly are. They're this kind of protective measure that they've put in place. But I do think if that's the way to think of it, it is interesting that the walls all come down except for the last one. So Nicky is let in, Mikey is let in, for all the four other examples we gave, or out. And it's just that last one that doesn't break. And I don't know what to make of that then.
Well, I do think it is noteworthy that I actually would kind of distinguish both the final scene at Mikey's house in which the door doesn't open,
right,
and the previous version of it at Nell's when Nicky goes back the second time and breaks through violently.
Right,
he's not let in. There's
yes,
right.
That's true.
So I think part of what happens is that they get increasingly violent. You get, or the violence becomes like the way in more and more. The first door at the hotel, Nicky won't let Mikey in the hotel room. And at a certain point, Mikey starts throwing himself against the door as if to bust it down. And he starts screaming, "Everyone's coming. They're all coming."
Right.
And it's that the kind of rhetoric, I think, gets him in more than the violence. But by the time you get back to Nell's house with Nicky, she does not want to let him in, and he forces his way in. He breaks the chain off the door and kind of kicks his way in.
I mean, she also in that sequence right after he breaks in, says this. I don't know. Maybe this is the only time I can think of right now, but says exactly. She's like, "I see you for exactly who you are." She just says it straight up. She says,
"What is it?"
You told them. You told them to try it. Both of them.
I told them to do that? Are you crazy?
Don't. I know. They told me. Both of them. I know all the things that you say about me. I know all about it.
The thing that neither Mikey or Nicky can do to each other, she has shown that she could do to Nicky. And it is interesting that comes after he breaks she refuses to let him in at that point, but he just breaks his way in into the apartment.
I mean, I think there are lots of interesting scenes in the movie. I think the scene where she gets assaulted the first time they go over to her apartment, I do think she does not want to have sex with him, and he coerces her, basically. And, she says no right from the beginning, and he doesn't stop. And it's a very, very interesting scene for a number of reasons. Elaine May, I don't know how much you know about her kind of whole history, but she became a huge star in the 1920s as part of a double act with Mike Nichols. They were at the University of Chicago together as undergraduates. They were part of a group of undergraduates there that formed the Compass Theater, which later turned into Second City. So they were the original group that was part of inventing contemporary comedy and contemporary improv. At a certain point, they developed this act between the two of them. They moved to New York and became huge stars. They put out 3 comedy albums. They had a nightclub act that became the hottest ticket in town for like a year. They moved to Broadway. And then after like 3 years, maybe, something like that, she broke up the act. She didn't want to do it anymore because it was the same thing over and over, I think. But she never has really talked about exactly why she broke it off. But, her partner's name was Mike Nichols, which is Mikey and Nicky. So there's like a whole set of questions.
I see. I did not think that.
And the movie is about a partnership dissolving and this kind of recrimination between longtime friends and having this sense of intense competition with the other that you can't let go of. And one of the kind of centerpieces of their act was a scene called Teenagers, which you can find on YouTube. You can find a lot of their stuff on YouTube, which I highly recommend. All, I think, super interesting. Teenagers is a scene where there's the two of them are parked in a car, and Mike Nichols plays a high school boy who has heard from his friend that the Elaine May character will sleep with boys. And so he has asked her out and is very awkward, but is trying, that's why he's there. And she knows it. And he's trying to make these moves on her. And she's putting him off in various ways. They're both smoking cigarettes the whole time. And she's kind of like, she keeps saying, oh, we have to get to know each other and so on. But it's the exact same dynamic that you have with Nell. Nell is just the nightmare version of it.
Yeah.
In the teenagers version of it, part of the joke that, it's like an 8-minute scene or something. And for the first 6 minutes, she's, they're kissing, but she's kind of like putting it off. She keeps saying like, we have to get to know each other. We should have a second date. And then at a certain point, she realizes that she's attracted to him. She changes her mind in the middle of the scene and says, okay. And she goes to take her sweater off, and now she's ready to get serious. And then the joke is the Mike Nichols character has no idea what to do and starts putting her off immediately. It's all of the same conversational gambits that she was running on him. He now starts running back on her. And that's the end of the scene. But it is, I think, the same scene in a sense, run as a comedy the first time in 1961. They developed it earlier in the 50s, but, she then brought it back. The other thing I'll just say about her specific history, which I only found out last year because she did a series of interviews with TCM about her whole career and talked about this movie in particular. This is a story that she had heard about from her childhood. It was based on a real life story in which her mother, Elaine May's mother, was friends with Mikey's widow. So it was a story that she had grown up hearing about, in which some version of this happened. The one guy was gunned down at the house of the other.
Wow.
And she wrote a one-act play at the University of Chicago as an undergrad that was the first version of this movie, and then continued to kind of obsess about it. And as soon as she got enough juice in Hollywood, she had a script, she gave it to Peter Falk, and he agreed to make the movie, and that's how it got made. But it's a very clearly personal movie for her in like 8 different ways. And I think the strong sense in which it's a very interesting, I think, scene in that we're watching someone listen to someone be assaulted. We're not we don't actually see. She keeps it very obscure. It doesn't linger on Nell or her body. A lot of the things that happen in movie rape scenes, usually she really avoids, I think. And so then you have this kind of horrifying aftermath in which Nicky finishes, gets up, walks over to Mikey and says, basically, it's your turn. After she's done nothing but say, like, please stop.
Yeah.
She wants to kick them out. And finally, with Mikey, who she has no relationship at all, she bites him when he tries to assault her, and they then do leave. But, it's a horrifying scene, and it's a scene about Nicky using her to compete with all of these other guys, and to have his own sense that he's winning again. And that, we said at the beginning, Mikey, said, "Oh, you made me look like a joke" in front of her. I do think that is this sense that they're in competition with each other.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that scene is so difficult to watch for so many reasons. I mean, one of which is that the first time you don't know what the relationships are between any of these characters, and so you're like, it's so unusual to see this kind of thing play out.
It's a movie with 2 scenes that I think are just wildly upsetting. The first scene in Nell's apartment, and then the final sequence when Nicky shows back up at the front door and he's gone down. They're both some of the most upsetting scenes I know in certainly in Hollywood movies.
I mean, this reminds me, I mean, and not that one needs to be reminded of this, but like both of these characters, Mikey and Nicky, are extremely toxic, to put it lightly. I mean, these are guys who are openly misogynistic, openly racist, openly, just aggressive to strangers. Is there more to this than just, this is a characterization of the gangster life? Or do you think this is something Elaine May is getting at about masculinity or just like male friendship in general, that this is like, I'm showing you as a woman director, like, I know what quote unquote, like what we would now call locker room talk is like I know what you guys are like, I'm going to just show you it for 90 minutes, unfiltered. But anyway, I do you feel like this movie is speaking to something about masculinity, or,
very much so. Yeah. I think it's a movie about misogyny and about misogynists. It's a movie where you spend 2 hours hanging out with 2 very deep misogynists. And I think it's part of why I'm so interested in it is I think it's a movie that avoids the reproduction of the kinds of pleasures of misogyny and misogynist violence that the 60s and 70s and the 80s really shot through internationally, really. And so I think it's about contemporary masculinity and specifically, it's about contemporary misogyny and the way in which contemporary forms of misogyny are tied up with the sense in which we're all in competition with each other all the time.
And they feel powerless. And that's partly what's driving the, anyway, sorry.
And that feeling in competition with each other all the time means that we have to make ourselves alone and isolate ourselves. I think this is related to the door issue, is that this sense of really having to shut oneself off. And I think I think it's important that Nell is not married. She does not have children. She has this kind of space in which, it's the early 70s, and it's the kind of emergence of new possibilities for women in terms of the workforce, in terms of, not having to be married in all of the ways in which that was not exactly true in the 19th century, certainly, and earlier in the 20th century. And I think that's part of why Nicky assaults her as he does. And, I think part of it is about insisting that men are constantly in competition. And one of the things they constantly get to be in competition about is women, and that women are the domain in which men get to fight. And that's the structure of contemporary misogyny, essentially. Or at any rate, one dominant form of it.
I mean, I could definitely see that. I mean, and it's just to speak also to the point you made about the kind of how unglamorous this misogyny is, and how that, I mean, just let's put the contrast with The Godfather, where you could watch The Godfather, I think, and think that Michael Corleone is a paragon of masculinity. He's the cut, I think a lot of men did watch that. They thought, yeah, this is how you should be. You should ascend the ranks, with honor, and then you should be a jerk to your wife and shut her out. The final shot of The Godfather is like him shutting out Kay or whatever. And it's like all cool and it's shot by Gordon Willis and it looks awesome. And then this is just refusing to glamorize or lionize this behavior. It's again and again showing you how petty and horrible and the sort of emotional and moral toll that it takes on other human beings who live in fear and are being assaulted, and even on these men who, as you put it nicely, are in the context of this competition, are reduced to paranoia and
isolation.
Yeah, exactly. And anyway, in that regard, I mean, watching it it makes it a challenging watch for a lot of reasons. Obviously, just because the subject matter and what's happening, and it's so rough, but then also not knowing that the first time you're watching it, and you're thinking in the context of 70s gangster films, it is going to be, or it could very well be, putting this forward as normal. Yep. I mean, not knowing anything and just going into it thinking, oh, okay, then I'm not feeling very comfortable about a lot of this stuff because, it's just sort of putting it forward and it's not commenting on it very much. And then of course you get to the end and and it all comes together. But yeah, I think for a lot of reasons that it makes for a very challenging viewing experience.
I agree. I really think part of what's so challenging about it is that it's incredibly funny. It's a very funny movie.
It is true.
And it's also a very horrifying movie.
Yeah.
And I think if you start to ask yourself, okay, point to the things which are horrifying, then point to the things which are very funny, you often find yourself pointing at the exact same things. I think I'm blanking on the name of the actor who plays Nell. Completely incredible performance.
Yes.
And Rose, I'm forgetting her name, but she, she's been assaulted by Nicky, and now Mikey and Nicky have switched places. Mikey comes back over and starts giving this like incredibly misogynist like small talk that he started the scene with, in which he's amazed that she's interested in current events, that she's a curious person, that she has this kind of like intellectual life. And she says in response, he starts kind of like making this small talk patter again as he's like trying to put a move on her or something. And she says in response, yeah, I guess you're right. Most girls are dumb. And I think it's a horrifying scene. And it's also, it is, I think, it's written as a tagline.
Yeah.
You know, and she delivers it in a way that's like, I at least often when I watch it, like start to laugh and then catch myself because it's like all of a sudden I've got nothing but bile in my throat. So, you know, and I think the whole movie is like that, really, that it's you know, the scene in which their racism becomes like really explicit it has jokes, working at the same level in which they're like expressing their racism in this way that's just like building tension, and then it snaps and you laugh, even though you're horrified by it.
I mean, part of what I think is so funny about that though in Nsima Deli is that she's basically just like, let's cut to the chase. Let me just say the thing you're presupposing out loud. Like, I'll just say it out loud. Like, you're amazed that I'm interested in current affairs. Okay, so basically most girls are dumb, you know, like, and it's just like saying it so bluntly, and he doesn't even really react. He doesn't even realize that how absurd that is. Because again, he thinks of himself as a good guy.
Making really explicit what he's thinking.
Yeah.
And also making clear that he wants her to agree with him. That she's giving him the agreement in this way that is like what he wants nominally.
Yeah.
Right. And I think it does serve as this kind of like, she's clearly the smartest person in the room.
Yeah.
Kind of by far.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, once you start to think, and that line is like, makes it really clear that she's way sharper than he is.
Yeah.
And he doesn't, he barely registers with them.
Exactly. He doesn't even realize how misogynistic what he's been doing is. He thinks of him, he's like, I'm giving you compliments.
Right.
Another funny part of the movie, I think, in the beginning, you know, Nicky is got an ulcer. And so Mikey's like, all right, I got to go get some half and half. So he runs downstairs and then there's this interaction with this guy at the diner where the guy's like, no, sorry, man. We got these little creamers. And he says, all right, well, what if I think eventually he gets to say something to the effect of, I'll buy 15 cups of coffee and you get to put the creamer in there. And the guy's like, okay, fine. And then you
can't put the creamer in the coffee though. You have to keep the creamer separate because
you have to keep the creamer separate.
He has nothing to do with the coffee. But
it's so good. And then after he's agreed to buy 15 cups of coffee or whatever to get this creamer, he just snaps and he jumps over the counter and starts beating him up. And I just think it's so funny. It is just like, I was thinking, okay, this is going to be a comedy. You know, this is a very early scene in the film. So I'm thinking, okay, I could sort of see how this is going to go.
And that's also right on the heels, right, of him trying to give the antacid to
to
Nicky, which is also like, as somebody who's tried to feed medicine to a child, I was like, this is so real. I was like getting some serious flashbacks to my own experience of like, you know, my kid's like dodging his head like a viper too. What is that? What is that? I'm not gonna like that. Is that the flavor I like? Absolutely. Hell no. Like, and I'm like, poison. I'm like, get, but it's going to make you feel better. And he's, no. And then he's like, I'm going to vomit it up.
Give me some milk and some cream in separate cartons to go.
Just got milk.
No cream?
Not to go.
What do you put in the coffee here? You have any cream?
Use these little bottles here.
All right, give me 15 of those little bottles to go. Give me a couple of cartons of milk.
Can't do that. We don't give these bottles to go. If you want coffee to go, I put the cream in it right here and I use the dispenser right back there, sir.
All right, give me a carton of cream from the dispenser.
How many coffees?
Well, no coffees. Just fill up a carton of cream.
Can't do that. I wouldn't know what to charge you. Cream is for the coffee only. It's not for sale.
Charge me for 15 coffees and give me the cream.
15 coffees?
That's right.
You give me that in 30 seconds. You hear me or I'll kill you.
Okay, sir.
Because I'm crazy.
Okay.
Now give it to me.
Yes, sir. Okay.
Just give it to me.
Okay.
Give it to me.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many, and part of it is that Falk and Cassavetes are so committed to a certain kind of naturalism that they're able to toss these moments off in ways that feel incredibly real.
Yeah.
And then the more you see it, the more the joke, like the way in which the whole thing is structured around a set of jokes, I think you guys are exactly right about the scene in the diner. And it's the exact same structure that happens on the bus. In both cases, you have somebody who invokes a certain rule or bureaucracy in which they just insist this is what has to happen. This is what the rule is. This diner has no mechanism to sell individual creamer. We only sell creamer as part of buying coffee. And I only am the night man. I work at the diner. It's not out of my control. I cannot help you. Similarly, the exact same thing happens with the bus driver, where the bus driver says, it's the regulation of the company. You can't get off on the front. You have to get off on the back. And the tension builds and builds and builds until it snaps and it becomes incredibly violent. Right, where that's the punchline to it. The violence is like serving as the punchline. It's part of what makes, I think, the humor and the horror
it's the catharsis of that buildup.
Yeah, exactly.
What do you think of? We haven't talked too much about Ned Beatty, but what do you think of the Kinney character? I mean, because he's also the source of a lot of humor in the film. His sort of driving around. I haven't been able to find parking all night. We can all relate to that one, Kinney. But so I mean, he's sort of this third pole of this interesting triangle, and he's kind of in the background, just a second too late every time coming to the scene.
Yeah, first of all, I'm a huge Ned Beatty fan, and I love him in this movie in particular. I think he's very funny, for example, in the scene with Resnick, in which he and Mikey are trying to blame each other for what's gone wrong.
Yeah.
And he sees Resnick realize, oh, if I just send Kinney to Mikey's house, Nicky's going to show up eventually. Like, that's what the dynamic is.
Yeah.
You can see Kinney recognize it too, and he gets so smug and just he stops talking and just starts grinning. And Mikey just gets more and more panicked. I also think he's very funny in talking about how low the margins are on contract killing. You have to, ideally he would have enough money to have a driver, but he's got to keep the costs down. So he's doing everything himself. He can't afford a driver. I agree. All of the stuff with the maps and the arriving late and his own incompetence, the fact that is not that smart, that when he calls Resnick has to tell him to go into the theater and see if they're there. You can't just sit outside. So, I also think he's the one who's locally responsible for the violence. That is, he's the one who's going to pull the trigger. I think as a rationalizing gangster movie, it's Resnick is a rationalizer in a certain way in which it's his plan and he's having somebody else carry it out. And then you also have the contrast with Mikey, in which, Mikey is trying to describe what he's doing in a way that's not participating in a plot to murder his childhood friend. That culminates with them driving around. Kinney, keeps being like, is that him? I'll drive up and kill this guy. Is that him? And at a certain point, Mikey thinks they found him and starts yelling, "Let me out of the car, let me out of the car, let me out of the car." And Kenny refuses. So, I think the whole part of what's really interesting about making it a guy who's for hire, it makes everyone's relationship to the violence that they're all plotting stand at this distance of remove.
Yeah.
Is that him?
No.
This is the end. By the time I pay my hotel, I'm gonna pay my
right
fare here. I'm gonna pay my meals. I ain't gonna make anything on this. Now, we seen that guy before. I look like a schmuck. I only got about 3-4 guys that use me. Now I look worse because it was supposed to be easy.
It was easy. If it didn't take you 45 minutes to drive downtown, you would have gotten them in the first bar.
Damn well I could. Oh, no, you don't.
Fascinating film, I have to say. Do you have any last thoughts, Dan, about Mikey and Nicky? I'm sure you have many, but is there something you would want to leave us with about the film?
I mean, I'll certainly speak up for the rationalizing gangster movies generally. I think Mean Streets in particular is a really interesting contrast with Mikey and Nicky in the sense that it's, again, two childhood friends. They're both trying to get each other to do something, and like the movie is watching them like resist the other one, push them around. Both movies have a crucial scene in a cemetery in which they're there in the middle of the night. They've broken into the cemetery. They're hanging out, trying to convince the other to do what they want. I'll also just speak up for Elaine May generally. She is one of the most interesting artists of the second half of the 20th century in the United States, I think. She only made 4 movies, that is, movies that she wrote and directed. So there's A New Leaf, The Heartbreak Kid, which is very difficult to see still, Mikey and Nicky, and then Ishtar. And then she has a whole career as like the premier Hollywood ghostwriter. So she also, Warren Beatty became a director in the middle of the 1970s, and Elaine May was his screenwriter for, in particular, Reds. I think Reds is an incredible movie if people haven't seen it or haven't seen it recently. And it's a movie about early 20th century feminism, among other things, especially its first half. And Elaine May wrote that, as far as I'm concerned. So I just think, she turned into a person. They stopped letting her make movies. Both Mikey and Nicky, the producers tried to take it away from her. They campaigned against the movie in the press. And they dumped it to essentially no response at all. They dumped it into theaters finally. And then she went through a similar thing with Ishtar, where the people who gave her the money to make it then, before the movie was released, started campaigning against it in the press and talking about what a disaster it was. And it really was unfair to her reputation. And it meant that the thing she ended up doing was becoming essentially a ghostwriter, a polished person, in which she's the person that you hire for a lot of money to make the script funny. Once you realize it, she did that for Warren Beatty for most of his career. She did that for Dustin Hoffman for a lot of his career. But anyway, I just want to speak up for Elaine May, and for really, I recommend all 4 of her movies. They're all amazing in different ways. The other three are kind of pure comedies. Or, I mean, they're complicated movies in various ways. They're often very hard to watch. They're very Heartbreak Kid, for example, is one of the most painful movies to watch. It's straightforwardly a comedy, but incredibly painful. Anyway, I think for people who can hang with Mikey and Nicky, there's other great Elaine May stuff out there too. So.
Oh, well put. Dan, thank you very much for being here and joining us. And
thank you guys for having me. This was really fun.
Absolutely.
So fun.
Thank you. Yeah. And really bringing a really broad and I think insightful perspective on Mikey and Nicky, a film that I rewatched. I felt somewhat perplexed by while I was watching and it's just been rattling around in my head since then. And I think with this conversation, it's
this conversation is really helpful.
Help bring me to a better understanding of the film and how I was feeling towards it, which is all one can truly ask for in a good film discussion. So thank you, Dan. And so you mentioned at the top there's nothing you necessarily want to plug or anything, but there is going to be a book eventually at some point on Hollywood gangster films. Do you have a title or working title?
I do. The working title is Always Wanted to Be a Gangster, Practical Imagination at the End of the 20th Century.
Excellent. So maybe what we can do is folks should be on the lookout for that, but we can maybe have you back on when the book is out, and then we can do some promotion on that then. And for our listeners, we are at CowsPod on at cowspod.com on Blue Sky and Instagram. And you can find us on the web at cowspod.com. In 2 weeks, we will be talking to Jay Elliott about Risky Business. So tune in back for that. And Jay's working on a book on 80s rom-coms. So it should be good. We're having some good philosophers on.
You guys are in for a treat. I don't know the last time you've seen Risky Business, but
I think I may not have seen it all the way through because I panicked when I watched it as a young teenager.
You watched it with your parents.
I watched with my parents who had forgotten most exactly. Yeah. And I think I was like 14. And the minute that dress comes off of her, I was like, abort mission. And I don't think I've seen it.
I'm gonna just have to admit this right now on mic. I've never seen it. This is a blind spot for me, so I'm excited to check it out.
We're really excited. And we're good. Anytime there's a Tom Cruise movie in this podcast,
Laura's a big Cruise fan, so
I'm
there
ready
it is.
To go.
One of the great Tom Cruise movies and performances of all time, and another movie very interested in its audience's discomforts. So
excellent.
I was uncomfortable when I was 14
you were watching
next
it
to my
correctly,
parents.
although you should have been watching it with your parents. But
that was my first mistake.
All right,
I'll
folks.
just be uncomfortable with my husband now.
Yeah, exactly. We could just be uncomfortable
As
together.
God intended.
We'll just sit further and further apart on the couch, right? That's how you want to do it. You have your blanket, I'll have mine.
Perfect.
All right, see you guys.